I have just a 360 degrees overview about Basil's southern Italy, even though he never went over there, as you explained in the introduction. I'm simply gonna read. The script is fairly long. It should take like half an hour. My bibliography is l'Italie méridionale, l'Empire byzantin, then Catherine Holmes, Basil II, Governance of the Empire. Vera von Falkenhausen, that is the major study on Basil II's southern Italian government between two empires, southern Italy in the reign of Basil II. Also drew something from Nicolle, Arms and Armour of the Crusading era, 1050, 1350, because in the initial part there is some interesting stuff about the urban militias of southern Italy during Basil's reign. So the 50 years of Basil II's personal rule, 976-1025, constitute the clearest possible demonstration of how completely the fate of Byzantine Italy was subordinated to the empire's simultaneous crisis on every other front. Byzantine Italy in this period consisted of only two disconnected regions in the far south of the peninsula, Calabria and Lombardia, the latter the official imperial name for the remaining Byzantine possessions in Apulia and adjacent areas. They formed the westernmost remnants of Roman territory on the Italian peninsula. Calabria is the toe of Italy, essentially modern Calabria and southern part of modern Basilicata, almost uniformly Greek-speaking, Chalcedonian Orthodox, and subject to the ecclesiastical authority of Constantinople. Lombardia, essentially the old Lombard Duchy of Benevent, reduced to the coastal plain of Apulia, the Terra di Bari, and northern Basilicata, overwhelmingly Latin-speaking, governed by Lombard law, faithful to Roman rite, and culturally far closer to the neighboring Lombard principalities of Capua, Benevent, Salerno, Naples, than to the distant imperial capital. From the late 9th century onward, the imperial administration had pragmatically accepted this duality. Greek law, Greek clergy, and Greek liturgy prevailed in Calabria and Apulia. Catapans, from the Greek katepano, the governor general of the whole of Byzantine Italy, and strategoi, the military governors of individual cities or districts, routinely confirmed local Lombard gastals, the Lombard administrative officials, and judices, the judges, signing charters alongside Latin notaries, and left the Latin liturgy undisturbed except during the short-lived and largely unsuccessful Hellenizing drive of Nicephorus II Phocas, 963-969, who briefly ordered Latin rites suppressed. Liutprand of Cremona says, in omni Apulia seu Calabria, and created a new Greek metropolitan see at Otranto, on the Straits, with suffragans at Acerenza, Tursi, Gravina, Matera, and Tricarico, most of which quickly reverted to Latin usage after his death. Bishops and archbishops everywhere were local men. Many Apulian sees were deliberately raised to autocephalous archbishoprics, namely Bari, Trani, Siponto, to free them from the Lombard metropolitan of Benevent, and largely independent of both Rome and Benevent, and catapans showered lavish donations on Latin monasteries, including the great Abbey of Monte Cassino, the most important Benedictine house in southern Italy, situated beyond the frontier in the Principality of Capua. Papal involvement in southern Italy, southern Italian affairs was remarkably weak and intermittent, with Rome riven by local aristocratic factions and direct papal influence over Byzantine churches being minimal. Only in the very last years, when Basil Boioannes founded Troia and persuaded Pope John XIX, 1024, 1032, to take the new diocese directly under Roman jurisdiction, did a tentative reassertion of papal interest appear. The single command of the catapanate of Italy centered on Bari, the main Byzantine port and administrative capital on the Adriatic coast of Apulia, emerged in the 60s of the 10th century as a direct response to Otonian penetration. The Otonian dynasty, so Otto I ruled 936 to 73, Otto II until 983 and Otto III until 1002, sought to revive the Western Roman Empire and dominate the entire Italian peninsula. The Patricius Eugenius may already have exercised unified authority in the late 60s of the 10th century when confronting Otto I's attempt to extend influence over the Longobards princes. The office is securely attested by 970 and appears without qualification in the Escorial Tacticon, alongside the ducates of Antioch, Mesopotamia, Thessaloniki, and Adrianople, so it's really central from a Western perspective. Yet the catapanate remained highly elastic. When the center was under extreme pressure, the post could be left vacant. For years, most of the 90s and of the 10th century and the early 1000s, its functions temporarily assumed by the senior tagmatic officer of Bari, usually from the regiment of the excubitores of I Canati or by the separate strategos of Calabria. Senior appointments in the difficult decades were brief and unstable. Calocurus Delphinas, 982-83, John Amiropoulos, 988-989, Gregory Tarchaneiotis, 998-1006, Basil Mesardonitis, 1010-1016, and many others rarely held office longer than 12 or 18 months. The catapanate was governed through a flexible mixture of central Byzantine institutions grafted onto older thematic structures and local practices. At the top stood the catapan, when one was actually appointed, a senior general sent from Constantinople who combined military, judicial, and fiscal authority. Beneath him, the old thematic apparatus survived, strategoi of Calabrian until the early 11th century of Longobardia, turmarks, judges, decreti, protonotarioi, cartularioi, and a host of minor officials, many of them local men bearing Greek titles, but signing documents in Latin. Apulia retained large zones governed by Longobard law and Longobard gastals or judices, as we've seen, while Greek law prevailed in Calabria and parts of the Salento. The catapans and strategoi explicitly recognized this duality, with privileges granted to the new towns of the Capitanata in 1024, guaranteeing the settlers, quote, their Longobard law and customs, while Greek law continued in neighboring districts. Mixed courts were common. Bilingual documents, Greek and Latin on the same sheet, appear from the 90s of the 10th century onward, and judges freely cited whichever code suited the parties. This is, I think, very interesting. The juridical elasticity of southern Italy at this point. Taxation was collected in cash and kind through a combination of Constantinopolitan officials and indigenous notables. Receipts such as the 1016 Apodaixis from Palagiano show that even remote communities sometimes paid the catapan directly. After 1018, Boioannes introduced a more aggressive centralized style. New fortresses were administered by imperial comites. Garrisons were strengthened with troops from the central army, and the catapan began to intervene directly in ecclesiastical appointments and urban privileges. The system worked remarkably well, while strong catapans and adequate resources were available. However, it remained critically dependent on Constantinople and never fully replaced local power structures. The legal landscape was one of deliberate and pragmatic pluralism that reflected the mixed population and the empire's limited administrative reach. Two parallel systems coexisted without serious conflict: the Basilica, the Ecloga, and later novels in Greek zones, the old Longobard law of the Edict of Rotary, and the later Carolingian capitularies in most of Longobard Apulia for example, inheritance, dowry, land transfer, and criminal cases. Ecclesiastical law was equally flexible. Latin rite bishops and monasteries in Apulia followed Roman canon law, while Greek monasteries in Calabria obeyed Constantinopolitan synodal decrees. Only In taxation and high justice, did Constantinople insist on uniformity? For obvious reasons, these were the highest sources of income. This flexible accommodation, far more tolerant than the later 11th century attempts at Hellenization, helps explain why religious or legal grievances almost never appear as motives for revolt. The great uprising of Melos were driven by fiscal and political, not legal or cultural resentment. For the first 3.5 decades of Basil's reign, southern Italy was repeatedly sacrificed. The civil wars of 976 and 989, as you have already explained before in your brilliant introduction, the long Bulgarian War that absorbed the main field army from 986 until 1018, and the simultaneous need to hold Syria against the Fatimids left almost no regular troops available for the West. For most of the reign, the military presence was strikingly thin and defensive in character until the final decade. The catapanate possessed no large standing field army. Defense relied on local theme troops, urban militias, especially strong in Bari, the most important city, as we've seen, small tagmatic garrisons, schole, excubitores, icanari. So these were actually picked units, and occasional detachments from the naval themes of Cephalonia or Samos. Long stretches in the 90s of the 10th century saw no catapan at all. Islamic raids from Sicily, then under the Chalibate dynasty, nominally subject to the Fatimids, and Ifriqiya became almost annual events, with Gerace, Cosenza, Gravina, Matera, Oria, and the suburbs of Bari itself repeatedly sacked or besieged between 976 and 1009. The Annals of Bari, Lupus Protospatarius, Venetian chronicles, and occasional Arabic sources record the rhythm with painful precision. Gravina and Oria sacked in 976-77. Matera devastated, Gerace briefly occupied, and Cosenza's walls destroyed in 986. Repeated direct assaults on Bari in 988 and 1003. Cosenza reoccupied for several months in 1009. The hinterland of Bari reduced to misery by 992, according to a contemporary landowner near Conversano. Calabria bled population on a massive scale. Entire monasteries transplanted themselves to the Longobard principalities, to Rome, or even to Thessaloniki. Individual saints such as Vitalis, Sabas the Younger, Nilos of Rossano, Christopher and Macarius, Luke of the Menna, Nicodemus, Gregory of Cassano, Fantinus fled north or east. Greek monks and artisans appear founding new communities at Monte Cassino, Gaeta, Naples, and as far as a field as Cologne, Eastern Frankish Kingdom. Apulia, somewhat better shielded by distance and by the permanent tagmatic garrison at Bari, suffered less demographic loss, but descended into near anarchy among its own archontes, the local Longobard or Greco-Longobard notables. The Annals chronicle an almost unbroken sequence of assassinations, coups, and factional struggles. 979, the Protospatarius Porphyrius murders Bishop Andrew of Oria. 982, the brothers Sergius and Theophylax surrender Bari to Catapan Calocurus Delphinus. 987, the Protospatarius Sergius is murdered by the citizens of Bari. 989, Catapan John Amiropoulos executes the Icanatus Leo, the Cretus Nicholas, and the Protospatarius Porphyrius. 990, the Excubitores Bubalis and Peter are killed. 997, the Excubitor Macro Theodorus is murdered at Oria by the brothers Smaragdus and Peter. 998, the Cretus Busitus barely escapes a coup. 999, Catapan Gregory Tarchainiotis besieges Gravina and captures Theophylact. 1000, Smaragdus is finally taken and punished. We know this because the Annals of Bari just are this, in fact, annalistic entries that tell us every year what happened. Some of these local notables openly collaborated with Islamic raiders, by the way. Others oscillated instead between Byzantine and Western imperial allegiance. For the first 35 years, the Western powers were overwhelmingly predators rather than partners. the Calbid emirs of Sicily operating from Palermo and Mazzara and supported by the Fatimid fleet out of Mahdia and Tripoli treated the Byzantine, Calabrian Apulia as an open raiding ground. The Otonians regarded southern Italy as a legitimate sphere of Western imperial influence. Otto I had already forced the Longobarд princes into clientage in the 60s of the 10th century. Otto II invaded the Catapanate in 982 with the proclaimed intention of expelling the Muslims, only to suffer catastrophic defeat at Stila in Byzantine Calabria at the hands of the same Sicilian emir whose raids had provoked his expedition. The battle killed both the emir and the princes of Capua and Benevent, inadvertently removing the most dangerous organized opponents of Byzantine rule and allowing the Catapano-Calo-Kyros Delphinus to recover lost ground in northern Apulia. Yet the Western emperors never abandoned their claims. Otto III pursued a Byzantine marriage alliance in the late 90s of the 10th century while simultaneously competing for control of Rome and the Longobard courts. And Henry II would march south in 1021-1022 with the explicit aim of dismantling the new Byzantine order in the Capitanata. Relations with the German emperors, so basically the Holy Roman Empire, has oscillated between intense rivalry and pragmatic detente, though direct German intervention ceased for almost 20 years after Otto III's death in 1002. The Longobard principalities oscillated between the two empires, the indigenous Longobards, so Latin-speaking, as we've seen, Roman Rite population of Apulia, and the neighboring independent Longobard principalities, Capua, Benevent, Salerno, Naples, forming the single largest ethnic and political component of the region. Inside the Byzantine Catapanate, they supplied most of the local judiciary, watermarks, urban notables, and their law continued to be applied in large parts of Apulia alongside Greek law. Periods of cooperation alternated with sharp resistance. Capua, Benevent, and Salerno, for example, repeatedly served as refuges for anti-Byzantine rebels, primarily Melos of Bari in 1011 and again in 1017, and as staging posts for German intervention. At the same time, their rulers were perfectly willing to become Byzantine clients when circumstances favored it. Pandulf IV of Capua, the most predatory of them all, formally submitted to Basil Boioannes after Cannae in 1018, handed over the golden keys of his city, and fought alongside imperial troops until Henry II temporarily deposed him in 1022. The smaller maritime cities, Naples, Gaeta, and above all, Amalfi, pursued a more consistently pro-Byzantine line, driven by trading privileges in Constantinople and the need for mutual defense against Islamic piracy. Only Venice, among the Western powers, functioned as a genuine strategic partner for most of the reign. The Chrysobull of March 992 granted Venice a drastic reduction of commercial dues at Constantinople and Abydos in return for a perpetual obligation to transport imperial troops to southern Italy whenever summoned. The alliance was sealed around 1004 by the marriage of the Doge's son, John, to Maria Argyropulina, a close relative of the emperor. Venetian ships duly relieved the prolonged Muslim siege of Bari in 1002 and 3. Crucial context is provided by the Historia Venetorum of John the Deacon, finished around 1008. Peasant vessels assisted the defense of Reggio in 1006. These Italian maritime cities, not the imperial navy, which barely existed in the Western Mediterranean, but were the true bulwark against Calbid and Fatimid sea power. Defense, therefore, depended almost entirely on diplomacy and allied fleets with gifts dispatched to the Calbid emir of Sicily and embassies exchanged with the Umayyad Caliph at Cordoba, revealing parallel attempts to purchase Islamic forbearance or to set one Islamic power against one another. Byzantine southern Italy was a profoundly bilingual and bicultural society, as we have understood, whose fault lines did not yet run along the sharp Greek versus Latin divide, however, of the later 11th century, when the Normands had taken over, and a zone of striking religious coexistence and fluidity rather than sharp confessional conflict. In Calabria and the Salento, the population was overwhelmingly Greek-speaking, using Chalcedonian, and tied to a dense network of villages, monasteries, and small fortified castra, with a K, the Greek way of the Latin term, Calabrian asceticism remained extraordinarily vibrant, with saints such as Nilus of Rossano, most famously died 1004, his disciple Bartholomew of Grottaferrata, Sabas the Younger, Fantinus the Younger, and Vitalis of Castronuovo, embodying a vigorous Italo-Greek monastic tradition that radiated influence as far as Rome. Think about the relation of St. Nicholas Otto III and the same Monte Cassino. Many Greek monks and clerics migrated northward because of Arab raids carrying relics and manuscripts and founding or refounding monasteries in Lazio and Campania. In Apulia, especially the Bari-Trani-Barletta Triangle and the Tavoliere Plateau, the majority remained Latin-speaking Longobards who followed the Roman Rite and Longobard law. Between these two zones lay a broad band of mixed communities where Greek and Latin clergymen, notaries, and landowners coexisted comfortably, often within the same family. Catapans and Byzantine officials lavishly endowed Latin churches and monasteries. Social hierarchy was dominated by a land-owning urban elite, the archontes, the donatoi, the primati, who supplied judges, tourmarks, bishops, and rebel leaders alike. Below them were free peasant proprietors, tenant farmers, many paying the classic Byzantine triad of land tax, earth tax, and corvée, artisans in the ports, and a growing number of dependent paroikoi, so parishes attached to monasteries or lay lords. So private churches were really also typical of other parts of Western Europe at the time. Arab raids repeatedly displaced Calabrian Greeks northward into Longobard territory, even to Rome and Campania, while after 1018, Boioannes deliberately resettled thousands of Apulian Longobards into the new fortified towns of the Capitanate. Slavery persisted, mostly captives taken in raids or war, but the society was not servile in character. Pilgrimage traffic to Jerusalem via Apulian ports increased noticeably after the year 1000, and the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre by Al-Hakim in 1009 was widely reported in both French and Italian sources as a stimulus for Western pilgrims, some of whom would linger as mercenaries. By 1025, the province had become markedly more urbanized and fortified than in 976, with the religious map showing deep Greek roots in Calabria and the Salento, a Latin Rite but often bilingual clergy in Apulia, and no systematic policy of Hellenization or Latinization from Constantinople. Loyalty was owed less to Greek or Latin than to city, king, and patron. The economy was predominantly agrarian and local, yet showed clear signs of recovery and modest growth in the final 15 years of Basil's reign. Gold coinage, numismata of Basil II and Constantine VIII circulated sparingly. The everyday currency was the Sicilian Arab tari in Calabria and lower value Byzantine Milia Resia and anonymous bronze fulles in Apulia. Hoards and single finds suggest that coin circulation increased noticeably after roughly 1010. Land values rose in secure zones. This is, as you explained before, also connected with the stabilization of Basil's rule in the East. New villages were founded, churches and monasteries received larger donations, and the Catapan's own building program, fortresses, praetoria, churches, injected cash and employment. Fiscal pressures was real, right? Complaints about excessive taxation helped spark Melus revolts, for example. But the state extracted revenue efficiently through a mixture of direct assessment and farming to local notables. The province remained a net exporter of grain, oil, wine, timber, and later raw silk, while importing luxury textiles, glass, and spices via its ports. By 1025, the economy was markedly healthier, more monetized than half a century earlier, yet still far from the commercial dynamism that Amalfi, Salerno, and later Norman Bari would display. Trade was overwhelmingly maritime and concentrated in a handful of ports: Bari, Trani, Otranto, and outside direct Byzantine control, Salerno and Amalfi. Bari served as the administrative and commercial capital, handling grain, oil, timber, and slaves from the hinterland in exchange for Constantinopolitan luxury goods and Eastern spices. Venetian merchants enjoyed reduced duties, as we've seen after the 992 Crucible, and regularly transported Byzantine troops in return. Their ships relieved Bari from the Arab siege in 1002 and maintained the vital Adriatic lifeline when Bulgaria temporarily blocked overland routes because they arrived up to the Adriatic from the Balkans. Amalfitans, despite living under Longobard princes, traded intensively with Constantinople and the Islamic world, often evading Byzantine restrictions. Jewish merchants appear frequently in documents that were specifically targeted in Basil's Venetian privilege in favor of this case of the maritime city. Long-distance luxury trade, such as silk textiles, glass lamps, incense, ivory, remained modest in volume but highly visible in church treasuries. Arab raids disrupted coastal traffic until the early 11th century, but after roughly the second decade of the 11th century, security improved and pilgrimage traffic to Jerusalem via Apulian ports grew noticeably. By Basil's death, southern Italy functioned as a commercial bridge between the Byzantine, Latin, and Islamic worlds rather than a major entrepot in its own right, but one whose ports were steadily regaining vitality. Artistic and architectural production was modest in scale, yet surprisingly vigorous, especially given the insecurity of the previous decades. Calabria and the Salento remained the heartland of Italo-Greek culture. Rock-cut hermitages and cave churches known as laure continued to be dug and painted, often with simple but expressive fresco cycles reflecting the ascetic spirituality of figures such as Nilus of Rossano and his disciples. Excellent dated examples survive at Carpignano 1020 and in the crypt of Saint Christina at Carpignano, in fact. In Apulia, where Latin Rite patrons dominated, a distinctive school of church building emerged around the first quarter of the 11th century. Large three-aisled basilicas with transepts and domes over the crossing were erected or rebuilt at Bari, the old cathedral, Taranto, Otranto, San Pietro in the latter, Vieste, and Siponto, frequently with metropolitan Byzantine financial or technical support. Their sculptural decorations, capital transcende, altar screens, blends late antique Apulian traditions with current Constantinopolitan fashions, peacocks, lions, and interlaced patterns executed in a crisp, almost graphic style. Manuscript production in the Greek zones never ceased. Several important 11th century South Italian Greek codices, for example, the Typicon of St. Nilus for Grottaferrata or the lectionary Vatican Greek 2138, were copied in this period by scribes trained in Calabria or the Terra d'Otranto. Bronze doors, Bari Cathedral, Trani, Salerno, and precious metal work, book covers, or reliquaries, were still largely imported from Constantinople. However, local workshops in Bari and Salerno were beginning to imitate them. After roughly 1010, the catapans themselves became major patrons. Basil Mesardonitus rebuilt the Praetorium in Bari. Basil Boioannes probably sponsored new churches in the fortified towns of the Capitanata. Economic indicators were uniformly positive. New basilicas rose at Bari, Taranto, Bovino, and Vieste under apparent metropolitan patronage. The frescoes of Carpignano, as we've seen, that are dated to the same period. The mulberry groves of Calabria, heralding the expanding silk production. The Capitanata rapidly generated thus significant revenue at minimal administrative cost for the empire. By 1025, a modest but unmistakable revival was underway, laying the groundwork for the richer flowering of the later 11th and early 12th centuries. It was against this background of neglect, devastation, and factional violence that the first great rebellion erupted in May 1009. Melos of Bari, a wealthy and ambitious notable from Bari, probably of mixed Longobard Armenian descent and certainly Latin in culture and religion, whose family may originally have belonged to the old Armenian colony of the city, in fact, emerges as the most prominent local leader in Byzantine Apulia during the later part of Basil's reign. First attested in the same 1009, he organized a serious urban revolt against the catapan John Courcuras, briefly seizing Bari and several other Apulian cities before the rebellion was crushed in 1010, 1011 by the new catapan Basil Mesardonitus. Menus fled to Capua. His wife and son were sent as hostages to Constantinople, and his property was confiscated. He never sought simple independence for Bari on the Amalfitan or Venetian model. He appears rather to have aimed at replacing Greek catapans with native Longobard leadership, while maintaining nominal allegiance to one or other emperor. With his brother-in-law Datus, he seized Bari, Ascoli, and Troia. Catapan John Courcuras perished in the fighting. Constantinople reacted with unusual urgency. The new catapan Basil Mesardonitus, 1010-1016, assisted, if Sculitz is correctly interpreted, by the naval strategos Basil Argyrus from Samos, besieged and retook Bari after 2 months, crushed remaining resistance by June 1011, and received the surrender of most rebel centers. Melus fled first to Benevent, then to Salerno, and finally Capua. Mesardonitus immediately began reconstruction. He erected a fortified praetorium near the harbor on the future site of the Basilica of St. Nicholas, issued appeals for refugees to return under guarantee of safety, and conducted a demonstrative progress through Longobard territory to reassert imperial prestige. The respite lasted only 6 years. In 1016, 1017, Melus, moving between the courts of the Longobard princes and the shrine of St. Michael of Monte Gargano, the most important pilgrimage site, not just in sort of Byzantine Apulia times, but also since the early Italics, recruited several hundred Norman pilgrims and exiles, promising land and plunder. The Norman presence in southern Italy effectively begins in embryonic form only in the very last years of Basil II's reign, and is inextricably linked to the two revolts of Melus. A small band of Norman pilgrims returning from Jerusalem, led by figures such as Gilbert Boiter and later Reinulf Drengot, were recruited by Melus around 1016, 1017 to bolster his second rebellion against Byzantine rule. These adventurers, probably no more than a few hundred in number, some source says 250, inflicted surprising defeats on Catapanal forces in 1017, 3 successive victories over Catapan, Contole, and Tornikios, ravaging much of Apulia and coming close to destroying imperial authority in the province. But early victories encouraged fresh waves of Norman adventurers and alarmed Constantinople. In December 1017, Basil II appointed Basil Boioannes. In Italian sources, it's called Bojanus, Boianus. In Greek, it's Boioannes. In fact, a commander of possibly South Slavic or Bulgarian origin, because they thought of Bayan, like those Slavic chieftains, who had distinguished himself in the final Bulgarian campaigns as catapan with plenary powers comparable to those once exercised by Nikephoros Uranos or David Arrhianites. He stands out as the single most effective Byzantine commander ever to serve in southern Italy and the architect of the empire's last great phase of authority there. Reinforced by troops released from the Danube front, including the elite Varangian Guard, specifically requested to face the Norman heavy cavalry, the rivalry between the two, of course, is already there. Boioannes won 3 successive engagements in 1018, the decisive battle taking place, famously enough, in October on the historic ground of Cannae, thus becoming the second battle of Cannae, the Second Punic War, beside the Ofanto River. The Norman leader, Gilbert Boiter, fell in this battle. Melus's army was annihilated. It said that only 10 Normans basically survived, and Melus fled north, first to the Papal States and then to the court of Henry II, the last Otonian ruler, at Bamberg in Germany, where he was honorably received and granted the rather empty but still meaningful title of, quote, Duke of Apulia. He died in 1020, broken and far from home, before Henry's expedition of 1021-22 could achieve anything concrete in southern Italy. Surviving Normans initially dispersed, though most were crushingly defeated as Gilbert was killed. Within a year, however, Boioannes pragmatically hired a Norman contingent himself to garrison the newly founded fortress city of Troia, 1019, thereby turning former enemies into salaried troops of the empire, marking the first official Byzantine employment of Normans in Italy. Datus held out until June 1021 in his fortified tower on the Garigliano River before being betrayed, brought to Bari, and executed by drowning in a sack together with a monkey, cock, and snake, as a form of ultimate humiliation. His repeated defeats and eventual death did not end the movement. He became a martyr figure for Apulian particularism, and his son Argyros would later lead further anti-Byzantine risings in the 1040s, at a time, great destabilization after Basil's reign. Boioannes transformed victory, however, into permanent gain. The turning point came only after the annihilation of the Bulgarian Empire in 1018, released the victorious Tagmata and Varangians for service in the West, marking the moment when the Western powers ceased to be predators and became, for a brief decade, objects of Byzantine manipulation. For 1017 onward, reinforcements including Varangians, Bulgarians, and Macedonians arrived. A chain of new fortresses was built across the Apulian plain and the Capitanata to shield mostly from the Apennine. In fact, in 1019, Boioannes founded the fortress city of Troia at the critical Apennine Pass, commanding the route into the Apulian plain, where the Longobards routinely came to plunder. Initially garrisoned it with loyal Normans. Over the next decade, he created an entire defensive belt across the previously desolate Capitanata with new settlements at Civitata, Dragonara, Fiorentino, Montecorvino, Tertiveri, Melfi, Mottola, and others. Privileges issued in 1019 and renewed around 1024 deliberately invited Longobard settlers from the neighboring principalities by guaranteeing the continued application of Longobard law and the preservation of Latin ecclesiastical rights. The result was rapid colonization, the digging of irrigation canals, the building of mills, and the planting of vineyards, turning a former wilderness into one of the richest fiscal zones of the catapanate within a single generation. Many Longobard families were forcibly resettled into the new fortified towns of the Capitanata, granted privileges under Longobard law, and bound more closely to imperial service. In the south, he fortified the Taranto hinterland with new strongholds against lingering Muslim raiding. Pandulf IV of Capua formally submitted, becoming an active Byzantine client. The Prince of Salerno accepted a comparable relationship. When Henry II, Holy Roman Emperor, led a large army south in 1021-22 to dismantle the new order, he in fact besieged Troia. Without success, however, briefly replaced Pandulf and withdrew after his local alliances dissolved, achieving de facto no lasting gains. In 1024, Boioannes even crossed the Adriatic, raided Croatia, and carried off the wife and son of King Krešimir III to Constantinople. That's a whole sort of different story. We are outside of Italy. We don't cover it, but Italy was used as a launching pad for storming those Slavic littorals and momentarily reasserting imperial influence over the entire lower Adriatic basin and securing the Adriatic itself, mostly also to the benefit of Venice, we should say. Now, by 1025, the balance of power among the Western actors had been almost completely reversed, as we've seen. The Chalbid Emirate was no longer capable of serious raiding. They had bled themselves white also against the Otonians. The Longobard princes were clients or neutralized. Independent Longobard princes had been reduced to clients, yet the Longobard element remained the demographic backbone of the province and would provide the social base for later anti-Byzantine feeling. Henry II's intervention had failed, as we've just seen. Venice was bound by treaty and marriage. Pisa remained cooperative, and the first Normands, survivors of Cannae, were enlisted as garrison troops. As Basil's death in 1025, the Norman element remained tiny, scattered, and still under imperial pay rather than independent. The great wave of conquest that would sweep the Byzantines from the peninsula belongs to decades after 1030, With Bulgaria annexed and Italy pacified, Basil II turned to the objective that had eluded every emperor since Constans II, 641-668. That is, naturally, the reconquest of Arab Sicily. The aborted Byzantine expedition to reconquer Sicily in 1025 represented the culmination of Basil II's lifelong ambition to eliminate the last major Islamic stronghold in the Western Mediterranean and secure the empire's southern Italian provinces once and for all. For decades, raids from Calbit, Sicily, and Zirid, North Africa, had repeatedly devastated, as we've seen, Calabria and threatened Apulia, exposing the vulnerabilities of the catapanate, despite the defensive successes of commanders like Basil Boioannes. In 1024-1025, a huge expeditionary force began to assemble, drawn from the victorious armies of the Balkans and the East, who were actually also veterans, and a diverse expeditionary contingent comprising the Rus, so the Varangians, Bulgarians, Vlachs, Turks, Macedonians, and others. The catapan Boioannes and the eunuch Orestes, a veteran of the Bulgarian and Eastern campaigns, who had already led an advance party to Messina, landing across the strait, rebuilding the fortifications of Reggio in Calabria as a staging point, just facing Messina, and may have, in fact, briefly occupied himself parts of northeastern Sicily as a beachhead, and being placed, in fact, in joint command. The main army concentrated the tip of the boot, where the walls of Reggio were rebuilt, and mulberry plantations, as we've seen before, the raw material for the Calabrian silk industry that would flourish in the following decades, mostly under the Normans, were probably established at this very time. It's possible they were also older, telling the truth. Basil himself intended to lead the final invasion in person. Consider Basil would never, set foot in Italy. So this was a matter of major international prestige, an undertaking that would have required a large fleet, probably relying heavily on Venetian allies at this point. Before the emperor could depart Constantinople or the full invasion force crossed the Strait of Messina, however, Basil notoriously died suddenly on this very December the 15th, about of 1025. You would have liked him to live that long, at the age, in fact, of 67. Now, his brother and successor, Constantine the VIII, immediately canceled the operation, also because he was not much of a person to lead such a thing himself, recalling the troops and abandoning any immediate hope of reconquest. The abrupt termination of the expedition marked the effective high water mark of Byzantine power under Basil, although a more famous attempt under Georgios Maniakes in 1038-1040 would achieve temporary successes. The empire never again came so close to recovering Sicily, which remained, in fact, under Islamic rule until the Norman conquest beginning in 1061. At the moment of the emperor's death, the Byzantine position in southern Italy was stronger, however, than at any time since the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Direct imperial rule extended across an enlarged and pacified Apulia and Calabria. Client relationships bound major Lombard principalities. The Adriatic was secured through Venetian alliance and Croatian submission. The Capitanata had been transformed from wilderness to prosperous frontier. Administration rested on a thin superstructure of centrally appointed catapans and tagmatic officers superimposed upon a deep substrate of local Lombard law, Latin clergy, and indigenous office holders, such as, again, like we've seen, the Marchi, the Gastals, the Judices, and bishops that were almost invariably local men, often rewarded with multiple sees, and even there were really lots of them in southern Italy, very also fragmented. It was not a very orderly administration. However, the new city of Troia was placed directly under papal jurisdiction with the agreement of John the 19th, but it was almost like, in terms of direct control, a sort of formality, like not really pretty substantial. Now, at Basil's death, the catapanate was militarily stronger and territorially more secure than at any time, right, since the 9th century, yet it remained critically dependent on troops and money diverted from other fronts, and on fragile alliances with Venice and local Lombard princes. The underlying structural weakness, lack of permanent fleet, and large indigenous army would become fatal in the following decades. Modern understanding of Byzantine southern Italy under Basil II rests primarily, just speaking of sources like you made before, great introduction, that say more in depth, like for southern Italy. It's a combination, of course, of sources that complement and correct one another, since the principal Byzantine narrative historian, John Sculizes, treats Italy only in a handful of very terse passages, and the later Byzantine tradition largely ignores Italy, right? Or also maybe for a matter of pride, given that it would go lost. The richest and most continuous thread is provided by the South Italian Latin annals and short chronicles written inside the Byzantine territories themselves, above all the three related redactions of the Annals of Bari, so the Annales Barenses, Lupus Protospatarius, and the Anonymous Barenses, particularly valuable for the precise chronology of the arrival and departure of the catapans and other officials, Arab raids, taxation, revolts, notably those, again, of Melos in 1009, 1011, and 1017, 1018. We've seen them all before. And activities of the great catapan Basil Boioannes after 1017. They are supplemented by minor local chronicles from neighboring Lombard principalities, namely the Chronicle of Salerno, and by the entries in Lupus Protospatarius that extend into the 40s of the 11th century. A second major group consists of archive material surviving in the original or in early copies, several hundred Latin and smaller number of Greek and private and public documents, charters, judgments, donations, inventories, are sort of the most typical juridical sources, preserved especially in the archives of Monte Cassino, Cava, Bari, Trani, Conversano, and Salerno. When combined with xylographic, that is to say, like lead seals of officials, and occasional epigraphic evidence, these give concrete detail on day-to-day administration, landholding, taxation, the coexistence that we have seen of Greek and Lombard law, and the names, titles, and tenures of local and centrally appointed officials that the literary sources almost completely omit. From northern Italy, the most sustained contemporary narrative is the aforementioned Historia Venetorum of John the Diacon, finished at the beginning of the 11th century, which repeatedly describes the Venetian-Byzantine diplomatic, commercial, and military cooperation in the Adriatic sphere. Hagiographical texts in both Greek and Latin are surprisingly informative, especially the lives of southern Italian or Calabrian saints composed in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Vita Nili Junioris by a monk of Rossano written around the 20s, the 30s of the 11th century, the Vita Sabae Junioris by Orestes, Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Vita Luce Abbatis, the Vita Gregorio of Cassano, and others. These often contain the precise chronological references to catapans, Arab raids, and the movement of Byzantine officials, as well as vivid descriptions of social conditions and emigration from Calabria in particular. Western narrative sources outside Italy are sparse and usually indirect, but occasionally useful. Tithmar of Merseburg died 1018. For occasional diplomatic contacts from sort of a German perspective, obviously. The French chroniclers Rodolphus Glaber and Ademar of Chabannes, both writing in the 20s and 30s of the 11th century, for the arrival, especially of, as you understand, Norman pilgrims/mercenaries, and the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009, tells you how much the Westerners were already sort of pointed at the Levant at that time. And very late 11th century Norman texts, the famous, William of Apulia, Matus of Monte Cassino, Geoffrey Malaterra. For the rebels of Melos and the early Norman penetration, they are really important, even though they were written half a century or more after the events. There was all an epopee at that point, however, about the origins of the especially the Haute Ville, later prevailing. Arabic sources are almost silent, except for very occasional mentions in Ibn al-Athir and other later compilers referring to raids from Sicily or Ifriqiya. This corpus, despite its fragmentary and disparate character, really typical of Islamic literature, especially in the West, is in fact unusually rich for a Byzantine provincial periphery in the early 11th century, and permits a far sort of overall sources altogether. A more detailed reconstruction is possible for most other frontiers in Basil's empire. Yet, this late triumph, and I'm ending here because it's almost time, was built upon two fatally weak foundations: the personal authority of an aging emperor who left no successor of comparable talent, the rapidity with which Boioannes' system later collapsed under weaker successors and larger Norman invasions, only underlying essentially the extent to which the late Byzantine revival in Italy was the achievement of one exceptionally able and energetic individual, backed for a brief window by the full resources of Basil II's empire at its zenith, right? And the failure to capture Sicily, which alone could have provided the permanent naval security and strategic depth the mainland provinces required, right? Mainland southern Italy would have obviously been very much strengthened and offered sort of further launching pad for invasions towards, say, central Italy, and making the empire more competitive against the Westerners had Sicily been secured, right? The Norman mercenaries, first introduced by Mellus and briefly employed by Boioannes, will ultimately exploit both weaknesses quite cleverly. But in the winter of 1025, 1026, the western frontier of the empire stretched farther than it had for 4 centuries, and appeared for one brief moment entirely secure. For one luminous moment, the Western powers that had preyed upon or contested Byzantine Italy for half a century were reduced to subordination or irrelevance, and the empire's frontier stood farther west than at any time since the age of Heraclius.
Thank you very much for your talk about Italy. That was super interesting.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was brilliant.
And thank you.
It was a pleasure.